Morning, everybody. I want us to keep the deeply moving imagery of the potter and the clay at the back of our minds as we reflect on our gospel reading from Matthew today. Now, we've been dwelling on Matthew chapter 13 for quite some time, both during the weekend and these days during the weekday masses. And finally, we are reflecting on the very last of the 8 parables in Matthew chapter 13, and it's the parable of the fishing net that catches all kinds of fish. This parable must be in some way considered along with the parable of the weeds among the wheat. And I want to reflect on that with you today. Remember that these 8 parables have dealt with the mysteries of the kingdom. Jesus asked the disciples at the end of this parable, do you understand these things? What does these things mean? It means the mysteries of the kingdom. Now, the parable of the fishing net, along with the parable of the wheat and the weeds, focus on 2 things. First, that we should put our trust in God's final judgment in the future. And I'll tell you why. Sometimes the word judgment doesn't always evoke a positive emotion in us. At the same time, there is a value to what is being said about God's final judgment in the future. And secondly, these parables focus on God's patient tolerance in the present. So yes, there is judgment in the future, but meanwhile, God is patiently tolerant. But let's deal with the idea of the final judgment. It's a very prominent theme in the Gospel of Matthew. Remember the story or the imagery of the lambs and the goats at the end on the final judgment. The lambs are the ones who saw the hungry, the thirsty, the homeless, and God invites them into the kingdom, whereas others are let go. Now, the idea of final judgment can sometimes evoke not very pleasant thoughts. Now, especially, we often try to resist the idea of making religion and faith legalistic. And it should be that way. It should not be legalistic. And sometimes we throw the baby along with the bathwater in the sense that then we also think that judgment does not matter. And we try to erase the idea of God as a judge from our minds. Now, if religion is legalistic, if it becomes that, and if the only image we have of God is that of a judge, then there is a problem. But the image of God as a judge by itself is not very harmful. In fact, it can be very positive. Why? The idea of a final judgment is not meant to scare us, but to give us confidence. For example, God is just and merciful, right? God's justice is always tempered with God's mercy. So that's one attempt to not make the idea of the final judgment or God as somebody who judges to be scary. No, it's meant to evoke confidence. Let's think further about this. The idea of judgment is necessary to evoke confidence in God. It gives us the assurance that God is a good God. It gives us the confidence that God cares about goodness in the world. It gives us the motivation to seek God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. If God is not just, why would we care about justice on the earth? So if we do care about the good in the world, if we care about justice in the world, then we have to also accept the idea that God is a just judge, that God makes a difference between good and evil. So this is meant to evoke confidence in those who seek what is good. God's judgment is also the recourse of the righteous. Remember the beatitude where Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." If God was not just, what use would it be if we hungered and thirst for righteousness in this world? Because God is not just anyway. Or God doesn't judge between good and evil anyway. So why bother about hungering and thirsting for righteousness now? So the idea of a final judgment is not meant to scare us, but to compel us to salvation. It is meant to encourage us to have trust in God's goodness. It is meant to encourage us to seek justice and righteousness in the here and now. And then, of course, we have the other imagery of God that emerges, of God's patient tolerance. So the two parables of the wheat and the weeds and that of the fishing net reflect how in the world out there is good and evil. And so here is what, I don't know how you think, but when I think about it, I think of myself as this good person. And then of course there's evil and, outside there, and somehow I need to keep myself from evil, and sometimes it seems unfair that in God's good world there is all this evil. And we want God to take away every evil so good people like us can survive, right? However, think about the parable in another way. If we look within ourselves, we realize that just like there is a world outside which is a mix of good and evil, the world inside is also a mix of good and evil. Each one of us is a unique mixture of sanctity and sin. But God is patient. And thank God that God is patient. When we think of the world outside, we think God is unfair to let evil still exist. On the other hand, when we look inside, it seems great that God is patiently tolerable. Otherwise, we would be destroyed as well. Because each one of us carries within ourselves the potential for evil, and sometimes we do commit sin. So God does not deal with us impatiently. God sees the evil within us, but God gives us the time to be transformed, to be molded, to be shaped like the potter shapes the clay. God is patient. God is kind. God is merciful. God gives us time till our very last breath to transform ourselves into images of holiness and sanctity. So these two parables, even though they may seem harsh, really are parables that make us reflect on God's goodness and God's patient tolerance. Not only towards us, but sometimes towards people that we may not admire or appreciate. The practical implication for us today. God says to the house of Israel, "Can I not do to you, house of Israel, as this potter has done, says the Lord? Indeed, like clay in the hand of the potter, so you are in my hand, house of Israel." So let us put confidence in the God who can shape us. The clay in God's hands is completely supple. so that God can form this clay. And so we need to have the trust to place ourselves in God's hands like wet clay is placed in God's hands. Let's allow God to shape us. Forget about tomorrow. Just today, let us be clay in God's holy hands. Let us have confidence in God's justice and God's mercy. People of God said,